Ahoy folks, Craigo here from Pure Xbox to share with you our impressions of the revived Alone in the Dark game coming to Xbox Series, PlayStation 5 and PC. Before we get going, this review was written by our lovely Ben Kerry and turned into a video by currently a rather poorly me. Well then, let's dive into this mystery.
My uncle's not well, Mr. Carnby. I want to make sure he's alright.
And what's my part in this? You couldn't get a cab?
I just wouldn't feel safe going alone.
We've been rather excited to get our hands on Alone in the Dark since THQ Nordic announced the series' revival back in late 2022, and after a few delays, it's finally coming to Xbox this week. The team at Pieces Interactive has reimagined the IP, taking elements of the franchise's first 3 games and combining them with a modern over-the-shoulder perspective. Unfortunately, whilst THQ's new title borrows plenty from the likes of Capcom's fantastic Resident Evil 2 remake, it never really gets anywhere close to matching up with it, creating an inconsistent experience that gets bogged down by its own convoluted storyline. Those Resi 2 comparisons are obvious right from the get-go, where you rock up to an old explorable building as either Detective Edward Carnby or his partner on the case, Emily Hartwood. And just like Resident Evil 2, each character offers up a slightly different experience.
Can you find me a knife to cut the canvas? I want to take this with me.
You want to take the painting? Sure, I'll find one.
For our review playthrough, we opted to play as Emily, and for one pretty major reason, we recommend other Day 1 players do exactly the same, and we'll talk more about why later on in the video. Anyway, once you've picked your chosen character and the team lays out the game's basic story setup, it's then you're off on your own way to find Jeremy, Emily's uncle. All is definitely not as it seems, and that becomes increasingly evident once you bump into any of the house's other inhabitants. Nobody's really bothered with helping you out, and it's soon up to you to explore every nook and cranny and root around every set of drawers to see what you can find that will help you on your way.
It worked.
Again, apologies for the silly amount of Resident Evil comparisons here, but yeah, your early hours in Alone in the Dark will feel quite familiar if you've played some of Capcom's slower-paced Resident Evil titles. You'll have to find keys, clues, and solve puzzles to progress through a big old mansion until you reach your end goal. There'll be plenty of backtracking to get done, and it's pretty familiar stuff, although we did quite enjoy rummaging around the game's big bayou residence during our first few hours. Once things progress, combat gets involved, and we're talking basic third-person shooting here. You'll have a pistol, a shotgun, and eventually an SMG at your disposal throughout Alone in the Dark, and combat is serviceable if nothing more. Weapons pack a decent punch with some nice chunky feedback, so it's definitely not the worst system we've played around with, although an annoying audio bug that often causes a delay in weapon sounds did dampen our experience. Some weapon upgrades and attachments wouldn't have gone amiss either. Alone in the Dark's combat gets the job done, but it does feel a little bit of a missed opportunity not hiding some neat scopes and weapon mods amongst the game's myriad of chests and safes. Regardless, you'll get into a nice rhythm in these early parts of the game, and initially we were intrigued at where the story was heading. An impending foe called the Darkman is served up as the game's carrot on the end of its investigative stick, and finding out more about him and his hold on the people of the house was definitely pulling us in. Kudos to the team for that initial encounter with the Dark Man. It was tense as all hell and easily the scariest moment throughout Alone in the Dark's relatively short runtime.
Whoa, what happened?
However, this serves as a bit of a turning point for us. Once this initial encounter subsides and the back half of the game kicks into gear, things get a lot more weird and supernatural, and to be frank, messy. Where the first half of the Alone in the Dark reboot feels quite grounded and detective-y, the second half certainly does not, and you'll find yourself being whizzed off to many a weird and wonderful location in search of how the Darkman controls his victims. The concept is cool, but it all gets a bit confusing. Not to mention the fact that these sections are much more linear compared to the puzzle box nature of Derceto, the game's main location.
This place? It's like something from my childhood.
It's just a private study of a very peculiar man.
On the topic of puzzles, generally speaking, they were fairly easy to tackle. Most of the game feels balanced in how it challenges you to problem solve your way to a correct solution. There were a couple of safe codes and picture puzzles that did stump us though, and in the end we felt like we had to brute force our way through some of them, getting a little lucky from time to time. Alone in the Dark is definitely more puzzle than third-person shooter, which we think is worth knowing before you head into it.
I need the key.
Remember near the beginning of the video where we mentioned a pretty major reason to play as Emily? Well, a puzzle that caused some other issues is one relating to looking at stars through a telescope, and this is potentially a game-breaking problem here, as Emily using the scope's focusing function merely caused both mine and Ben's Xbox Series X fans to absolutely scream in pain during the process. However, having spent more time with the game prior to Ben's first playthrough, I experienced full game crashing at the same point while playing as Edward, the game's other playable character. It wasn't your traditional crash to the dashboard either. Interacting with the telescope as Edward shut my Xbox Series X down. Not once, twice, but 3 times before I feared for the health of my console and decided best not to tread down that road again. I decided to abandon my playthrough as Edward, hence the reason we can only really recommend playing through Alone in the Dark as Emily right now. From my time with Edward, however, the varied story encounters branching in a semi-different direction from Emily's was one that I did want to explore, and it was a shame that it was cut short. Now, this could be a console-specific issue, and hopefully we do see a big old day one patch that sorts all of this stuff out before the game launches to the public. Glitches aside, Emily's story ramps up to a pretty typical boss fight right at the end of the game, which does feel a little out of place, but hey ho, you gotta get that final boss in. Am I right? Alone in the Dark is back, and frankly, it might have been better left alone. THQ Nordic's revival isn't a bad game. In fact, we enjoyed big chunks of it, but it doesn't stand out in any meaningful way, and ultimately feels a little pointless in the end. We'd recommend keeping an eye on that launch patch to see how the game is shaping up on release, but it's best not to expect a Resident Evil level reimagining from this Alone in the Dark reboot, even if it stands as a serviceable third-person adventure. Alright then, before I wrap up the case of Alone in the Dark, I figured I'd mention the performances of our protagonists, Edward Carnby and Emily Hartwood, both played by some really great actors too. David Harbour is my favourite murder Santa, although more commonly known as Hopper in Stranger Things, and Jodie Comer, who I first saw in My Mad Fat Diary, but fell in love with her acting in Killing Eve. These two, for the most part, are solid additions to the game. Their voice work is good enough and neither outshines the other. For me personally though, I find the animation and character rigging actually lets their performances down, and they feel like uncanny imitations of their talent. Still, Alone in the Dark is better for having them. Anyway, head on over to prxbox.com for more reviews like this one, and whilst you're here, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like if you liked, dislike if you didn't, and I suppose all that's left to say is bye-bye for now. Cheerio!
Grace! Grace!